native pollinators, who they are, how we can help them, and what we should not do. As soon as I get my clicker to work, we'll go on. Okay, first off, what is pollination? It occurs when pollen grains from the flower's male parts are moved to the female part. Once the pollen grains are moved, it grows a tube that runs down the style to the ovary where fertilization occurs, producing seeds. The process is vital in the life cycle of all flowering plants, and it's necessary to start seed and fruit production in flowers. Pollination benefits both flowering plants and pollinators. Pollinators visit the flowers for different reasons. Some of them are feeding, pollen collection, and warmth. And when they visit flowers, pollen drops or rubs onto their bodies. Then when they visit another flower of the same species, the pollen is transferred, hopefully resulting in pollination. All flowering plants depend on pollinators to reproduce, pollination of some sort to reproduce, I should say. Then once the seeds and the fruits have been pollinated, other wildlife eat that and spread the seeds that give rise to future generations of plants. Most of the world's plants and animals, including humans, need native pollinators to survive. So without pollinators, we'd all be in a whole lot of hurt. A native pollinator is just a pollinator that comes from a specific region of the map. There are lots of different kinds of pollinators. There's approximately 200,000 or 201,000 species. About 1,000 of those are vertebrates, such as birds, bats, and small mammals. And the others are made up of insects like flies, beetles, bees, wasps, etc. Later in the presentation, we'll focus on native bees, which include carpenter bees, adrenid bees, sweat bees, bumblebees, leafcutter bees, and mason bees. At the end, we'll focus on the cavity-dwelling mason bees. Some crops that depend on insect pollination. There's a lot more than these. This is just a small sample. But legumes and beans, vegetables, all kinds of vegetables depend on pollinators. Fruits, berries, and nuts. You can kind of look through the list and see if some of your favorites are on here. We have herbs and spices, oils, seeds, and grains, cauliflower and cauliflower relatives. There's so many varieties I didn't even try to list them. And others such as cotton and coffee. I know a lot of people here would be very upset if they did not get their coffee. So we can talk about pollinator syndromes. That is when the plants and pollinators co-develop physical characteristics that make them more likely to interact successfully. And I know that sounds kind of pompous, but basically the plant attracts a specific type of pollinator, and the pollinator evolves certain characteristics that make it easy for it to pollinate that flower. It says the pollinator benefits from its adaptation to a particular flower type by ensuring it will be able to find and access important food, nectar and pollen, and the relationship is mutualistic. The pollination syndromes are the flower type, shape, color, odor, nectar, and structure. They can be used to predict what type of pollinator you can attract with your flowers or flowering plants. This is just a chart of some of the pollinator syndromes. You can kind of look through this. And again, if I go through something too fast and you'd like more information, I always offer to email a copy of the presentation at the end. My contact information is there, and you can always get that from me. But for example, on this chart, if we wanted to know what kind of flowers would attract a butterfly, well, the color is bright red and purple. It has nectar guides present. The odor is faint but fresh. There's an ample nectar, but it's deeply hidden because butterflies have the long, for lack of a better word, tongue that they can get to the nectar with. It has limited pollen, and the flower shape is a narrow tube with a spur, a wide landing pad. So you can look at these on your own time and just kind of figure out what kind of flowers you have and what kind of pollinators to expect. Okay, there are many different types of pollinators, and this list is probably not all inclusive, but we have birds, bats, butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps, small mammals such as mice are actually pollinators, and bees. Bees are the main focus of this presentation. Beetles. Beetles are the largest group of pollinators just because there's so many types. They pollinate 88% of 240,000 flowering plants in the world. They were some of the first insects to visit flowers, and they're still essential pollinators today. Ladybugs are a beetle that is a friend to gardeners because they eat aphids. Many beetle species eat pollen, so the plants they visit produce a lot of pollen to make sure there's enough left over after the beetles are done eating. Beetles are attracted to spicy, fruity, or rancid flesh-like odors, which is gross, but apparently the beetles like it. And most beetles need a wide opening to land on the flower because they're clumsy flyers. Wasps. A lot of people don't realize wasps are also pollinators. And not only are they pollinators, they are predators of many insects, especially crop-eating insects. So wasps are actually good to have around if they're not building huge nests and you get stung. Some wasp species visit flowers for nectars and can be inadvertent pollinators. And it's very interesting. There's a blastophagia wasp. I assume I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's the only way certain fig trees can be pollinated. It actually crawls inside with the nectar on it. I mean, the pollen, excuse me. It crawls inside the flower with the pollen on it and reproduces, and then eventually becomes food for the fig. Okay. Butterflies. They're very active during the day, and they visit a wide variety of flowers. But they're less efficient at pollination than bees are because their thin legs don't have hairs on them, and they don't get as much pollen on their bodies because they're taller. They do not have specialized structures for collecting pollen either. However, they do probe for nectar and typically favor flat, clustered flowers that provide a landing pad and lots of flowers to feed on. Butterflies have good vision and can see red, but they have a weak sense of smell, so it doesn't really matter if your flower has a strong scent or not. And they do offer assistance, even though they're not as effective as bees. This is just a listing of some of the native butterflies for Virginia. You can look down through here. We have milkweed butterflies, which is the monarchs, emperors. We have leafwings. I mean, there's just a lot of them. And again, this is probably not all inclusive. It's just a sampling. But here's a look at some of the beautiful butterflies that do come through Virginia. We have the monarch on the left and the American lady on the right. Hummingbirds are very important pollinators because when they feed, their forehead rubs against the flower parts and the pollen sticks to their feathers. When they move to another flower, the pollen exchange takes place and they pick up more pollen from that flower to take on to the next. In Virginia, however, only one species, the ruby-throated hummingbird, is regularly found throughout the summer during the breeding season. But the calliope hummingbird, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, and the rufous hummingbird are occasionally seen passing through during the fall or winter. A lot of people love hummingbirds and they want to put up a hummingbird feeder, and I think that's great. But just make sure if you do hang a hummingbird feeder that you keep it clean because spoiled syrup can damage the hummingbirds. Also, you only need a simple syrup. You do not have to put in food coloring, honey, or flavored drink mixes as they can all damage the hummingbirds' tiny little bodies. The hummingbirds will remember if they found a good food source at your house from year to year, and they'll return. So if you start feeding them, you may have repeat visitors. The simple syrup recipe for hummingbirds is 1 cup of sugar to 4 cups of water, and you can increase that. You can do 2 cups of sugar to 8 cups of water, and so on and so forth. You want to boil it for 5 minutes, stirring it occasionally. Let it cool completely before filling your feeders. You don't want to give the hummingbirds food that is too hot. And the excess can be in the refrigerator for 7 to 10 days. To look for signs of spoiled nectar, if it's cloudy or milky or has black and white floating specks or string-like structures, it's gone bad. If it has a pervasive odor that could be overly sweet, sour, or moldy, it's bad. Mold or fungus growing inside the feeder or around the feeding ports, you need to clean them. And if it has floating or drowned insects inside the nectar reservoir or stuck to the feeding ports. Also, it can have sticky or crystallized residue around the feeding ports. Flies are another pollinator that maybe people don't realize are helpful. They can be annoying, but they can visit 1,100 species of flowers. And flowers need efficient pollination with a minimal loss of pollen and little energy spent on nectar as possible. Flies need nourishment, which involves finding the most nectar at each stop, avoiding predators, watching for mates, and staying warm enough to fly. So some pollinating fly species have evolved hairy bodies that a lot of pollen can stick to. And in a reciprocating gesture, some flowers have evolved ways to keep their insects warm. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about bees for a little bit. This is just a picture of some bees. One is covered in pollen and one's got its little tongue out drinking nectar. Honeybees. Honeybees are responsible for about 80% of the pollination of fruits, nuts, grains, and vegetables in the United States. They are, however, not native, but they're still very beneficial. They make honey, royal jelly, pollen, and beeswax. And also, honeybee venom therapy may help with several medications, several medical conditions, in humans as well. The honeybee is well adapted for pollination. Each colony contains thousands of individuals available to forage for pollen and nectar they use to rear their young. Their sense of smell, eyes, mouth parts, and other body hairs are ideal for finding food sources. In a single day, I thought this was very interesting. One bee makes 12 or more trips from the hive, visiting several thousand flowers, but on each trip, they only gather one type of pollen. So it's very useful for pollination because they know that once it picks up pollen from one flower, it's going to go to the same species and drop off the pollen. Okay, now we're going to talk about our native bees. Let me see. I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but it looks like some people are in the waiting room. Let me admit them. Okay, my apologies. Okay, what do we know about the native solitary bees? First of all, they live alone, so they don't have colonies, hives, honey, or beeswax, but they also don't have attack swarms. All females are fertile. Males are only for reproduction. So the only purpose that the male serves basically is to reproduce and make more solitary bees. The female has all the responsibility to take care of their young. They gather the pollen and nectar, build nests, and lay eggs. Most are gentle and will only sting as a last resort. They need to reserve their stings for emergency situations. Also, the stingers are barbless and they usually do not cause anaphylactic allergic reactions. Out of 21,000 bee species, only 7 are honeybees. The rest are solitary bees. Okay, why should we care about our native bees? Well, first of all, they pollinate native plants, including cherries, blueberries, and cranberries. They were here long before the European honeybees were brought to the country. They pollinate 80% of flowering plants worldwide. The USDA says bees of all sorts pollinate approximately 75% of fruits, nuts, and vegetables in the United States. And out of every 4 bites of food people take, it's 1 out of every 4 bites is courtesy of bee pollination. 1 in every 3 bites is due to a pollinator of some kind. And the bee population is responsible for more than $15 billion in increased crop value each year. Ground nesting bees. 70% of native bees are ground nesting, laying their eggs in burrows beneath the surface. They're among the earliest to emerge in the spring, and they're vital pollinators of cherries, plums, and other tree fruits. One example of a native ground nesting bee is the squash bee. It nests in the soil where pumpkins and other cucurbit crops are grown, such as cucumbers, melons, etc. And they're specialist pollinators of these vegetables and fruits. So who are our native bees? There's a list. We start with carpenter bees. They're large bees that resemble bumblebees. They're heavy-bodied and metallic blue-black with green or purplish highlights. Their bodies are covered with bright yellow or orange hair and are about 1 inch long. Bumblebees are similar. They're large, hairy bees that are about 3/4 to 1.5 inches long, and they're generally black and yellow in color. There's currently 14 species in Virginia. Their somewhat clumsy nature, as well as buzzing sound in flight, is the source of their name, bumblebees. Okay, a little bit more about carpenter bees. They can be readily identified by their slick, shiny black abdomen. The thorax is usually covered with yellow, orange, or white hairs. They're generalists, so that means they'll go to many different plant species and not just stick with one. They like to forage in the early morning. Carpenter bees are excellent pollinators of eggplants, tomatoes, and other vegetables in the garden, and also many types of flowers. Carpenter bees also have powerful thoracic muscles. That means when they land on the flower, they basically buzz the pollen out by using their wings. This is known as buzz pollination. Okay, a little bit about bumblebees. They forage less than 2 miles from their nest. They're not as commercially important as honeybees, but they are valuable pollinators, responsible for about 15% of the pollination of U.S. grown crops. They need a cavity to build their nest in. The queens are opportunists, which means she's just going to find any suitably sized cavity and reproduce. Sometimes it's above ground in hollow trees or abandoned bird nests. Mostly it's underground though. It says an abandoned rodent hole is a favorite because it's already warm and lined with fur. And also bumblebees do not nest in the same location repeatedly unless it just is a coincidence. Okay, more about our native bees. We have andrenid bees, one of the first species in spring to emerge. They're also known as mining bees. They'll nest in the ground near other andrenid bees when they find suitable soil. They swarm and fly up when people approach, but it's basically a bluff. They don't usually sting. They're only out for a few weeks each year when the female is making her underground cell for the developing offspring. They're small to moderate size and are similar to honeybees, except they're darker. They're considered beneficial pollinators of crops and fruit trees. We have leafcutter bees. You can see on the top right, it's carrying a piece of leaf. They use the leaf pieces that they cut to fill a nesting area for their offspring. They're also beneficial pollinators, and they resemble honeybees, but they're darker. Sweat bees are noted for their bright metallic colors and the collection of sweat for the salt. They can sting, and so that's a little annoying. I don't know if you've ever been stung by a sweat bee. I assume you have. But even though they sting, they are beneficial pollinators. And if you see a sweat bee, it often is covered in little yellow bits of pollen. And finally, we have orchard mason bees. They're efficient pollinators, and they can visit up to 60,000 flowers in this lifetime. They're very docile and rarely sting, which makes them suitable for urban situations as well. Naturally, low numbers can be increased with nesting structures, but be careful with nesting structures. We'll go over that in a minute. They can be more harmful than helpful. 30% of native bees are cavity nesting. The bees lay their eggs in beetle holes in dead wood or create nesting chambers in hollow or pithy stems, such as raspberries. Some, such as the leafcutter and mason bees, use man-made nesting blocks or cut pieces of bamboo for nesting. The mason bee is an example of the cavity nesting bee. Okay, I spoke about the bee hotels earlier. They're really cute, but you should not purchase one unless you go through a checklist to make sure it does not follow any of these traps. First of all, why you should not buy one. The nesting blocks, tubes, and reeds are not removable. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically, if they're not cleaned and sanitized yearly, you can get wasps, bees, flies, parasitic mites, bacteria, and viruses. And so inside, everything looks fine outside, but inside the larvae and pupa are dying at an alarming rate. You want to clean the houses every year if you have one of these bee hotels, and also use fresh nesting trays, blocks, paper tubes, and reeds. This is a picture of what can happen if you do not clean your bee hotel regularly. This poor little bee is overrun with mites. Uh-oh. My clicker's not working. There we go. Okay, why we should not buy a ready-made bee hotel continued. The nesting tubes are open at the back, allowing parasites to enter. Reeds or holes have splinters that'll snag and tear their delicate wings. The roof lacks an overhang to protect from moisture getting inside. The moisture can cause the larvae to rot and also can cause mites to flourish. If the material does not allow moisture to escape, such as paper tubes would be a good example of a good nesting material, it can cause bacterial and fungal pathogens and also make the pollen rot. And another good reason not to buy those, the nesting materials are often too shallow. In nature, mason bees lay fertilized eggs, which are the females, in the backs of long nests, and pack the front with unfertilized eggs, which are males. So if you want an ecologically useful proportion, you need houses with nesting tubes that are about 6 inches long. And this is just a little chart. Should I buy this really cute mason bee house? Well, the answer is almost always no, but if you can go through all these options, then go ahead and buy it. So if you're going to clean it each year, don't buy it if you're not. If the holes are 6 inches deep, if they're not, don't buy it. And so on and so forth. You can look at the rest of it later. Okay, so if you already happen to have a commercial mason bee hotel, what do you do? Well, for now, leave it up. At the end of the season, put it in an unheated shed or garage for winter to protect it from the birds. In early spring, put the whole house inside a cardboard box with a small hole in the top or side so that the bees can escape but not get back in. Set it outside in a place where it will stay dry, and after everyone is out, you can throw the house away, or at the very least, clean it. Okay, and this is just a infographic that tells about the mason bee life cycle. And the management is in this middle ring that tells you protect it from birds, retrieve nests, and so on and so forth. So how do I provide a safe nesting site for mason bees? Well, they need holes that are approximately 8 millimeters in size. They need a minimum daytime temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit. They need open balloons in the springtime, and they need moist, clayey mud for building their nest walls. And finally, they'd like a bee-friendly garden free of chemicals. So if you're wanting to provide a safe nesting site for mason bees, make sure you orient the house or whatever you're using so that bees can get the warmth of the morning sun. So you want to have a south to southeast facing site. You want to install the bee house on a sturdy fence, wall, or tree. Bees don't like swinging in the breeze. They only fly about 300 feet in search of nectar and pollen, so put their house near where you need their pollination services. Hang them at about eye level to protect them from small animals. And if needed, you can enclose the house in bird wire or hardwire cloth, but don't put it right up against the nesting materials. You don't want the bees not able to get in the, you don't want the bees to not be able to get inside the house. Okay, we have native bees and pest control. This is a quote. Basically, as a nesting season as well as pollination service ends for a cavity nesting bee if she's killed or lost due to pesticide effects. While negative pesticide effects on only some of the bees from a honeybee colony does not end the life of the hive or end the function of the pollination. In other words, we want to try to provide a pesticide-free area for these bees so we don't end their life cycle. Many solitary bee species are some of the best pollinators. Bumblebees and solitary bees do better pollination for blueberries, alfalfa, cucurbits, orchard fruits, and nuts. It's because of their behavior and the fact that honeybees wet the pollen before stowing it for transport, and many of these species carry it dry so it can fall off their bodies more easily and more efficiently fertilize the flowers. So as far as pesticide use goes, the label is the law. The label will provide appropriate usage information. It's a legally binding document, so make sure you read, understand, and follow the label. And for other bee-friendly pest control options, we have floating row covers. It's little covers that look like a tiny greenhouse or something. It allows sunlight to get through, but the pests are kept out. You can hand pick bugs off your plants. It's time consuming, but it does work and it is 100% safe for bees. You can get bug traps. These are traps that they're bags with bait in them. You hang them in your garden and wait until they fill up and throw them away. Crop rotation is another practice that's good for pests and also protects our bees, because bugs usually return to where they found a preferred crop. And if you use crop rotation, the bugs won't be able to find the same crop there. So they'll have to work a lot harder to find your crop the next year. We want to attract beneficial insects using companion planting techniques to help attract good predatory insects to eat the bad bugs. Plant things like marigolds in your garden. They can draw good bugs and deter the bad. Another one is to keep your garden weed free. It does not allow as much for the bugs to feed on, and it makes it harder for pests to find a place to hide. You can be surprised at how much it can deter unwanted pests. And another option is to get some guineas. They eat almost every bug they come in contact with. So in summary, pollinators come in many different forms, and life depends in no small part on their continued work. We can all do our part to appreciate these little guys, whether it's through building them a house and making sure to do the regular maintenance, or it's through planting more native flowers and making sure not to use pesticides carelessly. I hope from this presentation you come away with a more profound appreciation for what the pollinators do every day, and maybe you might send a little love their way every chance you get. There's some references, and does anyone have any questions?